7-minute speeches from all of the panel first. These have 1 minute protected time at the beginning and end of the speech, which is marked by the gavel, one knock at 1 minute, and then again at 6 minutes, and then to mark the end of the speech at 7 minutes will sound twice. Within the central 5 minutes, we'd encourage you to ask questions towards the speaker. If you have a question, please just stand up and say point of information, and if they accept to take your question, fine, just if you can keep it fairly brief to allow them a chance to respond to it properly. After we've heard from all 6 of the panel, we will then turn to the audience for floor speeches. These are 3 minutes in length and can be in proposition, opposition or abstention of the motion. They have 30 seconds protected time at either end of the speech, which is signalled in the same way as before. And the floor speeches this evening, which will be judged by Bonnie and myself, and we have a box of port or chocolates to award as prize for what we judge as the best speeches of the evening. After we've had some floor speeches, we'll return to the panel for the summary speeches. Firstly, the opposition side, and we'll then turn to proposition side and then vote on the motion. And after the debate this evening, we will head to bar at TCR. Please do join us to continue the debate in a slightly less formal environment. And if you want to get involved with the debate on Twitter, #UCLUDS, as always. So finally, to introduce the speakers we have with us this evening. In proposition of the motion, we have Mark Reckless MP, who's Conservative MP for Rochester and Strood, a leading Eurosceptic MP. Previously, he was UK Economist for the investment bank Warburgs and was rated as one of the top 3 economists in the City of London. More recently, he has worked as a barrister before being elected as MP in the 2010 general election. And in October 2012, he led a successful vote against the coalition government in the House of Commons to secure a cut in the UK contribution to the EU. Also speaking in proposition is Alexandra Swan, who's a Telegraph blogger and UKIP activist, described by Michael White of The Guardian as the future face of UKIP. She has been an outspoken member of UKIP after defecting from the Conservative Party in March 2012. She's worked in the Houses of Parliament for 2 Conservative MPs and the European Parliament for a UKIP MEP. She regularly writes for Telegraph blogs and The Commentator. Also speaking in proposition is Lawrence Webb, who's a leading member of UKIP, former London chairman and mayoral candidate. After joining UKIP in 2000, he has worked on political assistant to Gerard Batten, who's a UKIP MEP for London, as well as the party's chief organiser in the capital. In 2012, he ran as the UKIP candidate in London mayoral election, campaigning against EU legislation. Before entering politics, he previously worked as a nightclub owner and electrician and spent 8 years in the Territorial Army. Please join me in welcoming our proposition team this evening. Speaking in opposition of the motion, we have Katinka Bayesh, who's Deputy Director of the Centre for European Reform in London, which is an independent London-based think tank that seeks to make the EU work better and strengthen its role within the world. She has acted as an advisor to the European Commission, several EU governments and the House of Lords, the World Economic Forum, as well as various financial institutions, multinationals and business federations. She regularly comments in Europe in the national media. Also speaking in opposition, Sir Stephen Wall, who's a former UK diplomat and chair of the UCL Council. He served as member of HM Diplomatic Services for 35 years, and with positions including British Ambassador to Portugal, Permanent Representative of the European Union, and Head of European Secretariat in the Cabinet Office, and EU Advisor to Prime Minister Tony Blair. He authored a book, Stranger in Europe, Britain and the EU from Thatcher to Blair. And our final speaker in opposition of the motion is Peter Wilding, who's founder and director of British Influence, which is a new independent advocacy campaign that wants Britain to lead in Europe. In 20 years of working in European affairs, he has practiced and lectured as a solicitor in EU law, been head of media for the Conservative Party in the European Parliament, and director of the European B-Sky B. He regularly appears as the BBC's Europe Direct and authored Influencing the European Union. Please join me in welcoming our opposition side. like to welcome Mark.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I stand proud to propose that Britain should leave the European Union. I believe in a free Europe of independent trading and self-governing nations, a Europe where countries work together, yet maintain their sovereignty and democratic integrity. The European Union we now have is not that Europe. In the European Union that exists today, the unelected Commission is the only body allowed to initiate legislation. From Ireland to Greece, Euro-inspired and Brussels-enforced austerity wreaks savage social as well as economic destruction. Whenever a people votes in a referendum, then enough is enough. In Denmark, in Holland, twice in Ireland, even in France. The democratic voice is set at naught, and the EU just carries on regardless. The European Union is incapable of decentralising reform, because its very raison d'etre, its founding purpose, is ever closer union. Whatever the problem, the solution in Brussels is always more EU law, more EU spending, more Europe, even when it's the EU that's caused the problem. Indeed, particularly when the EU's caused the problem, as we see with the euro. I would like to define this evening's motion and what is meant by leaving the European Union. I believe that we should be an independent country, trading with Europe, but governing ourselves. We should renegotiate our relationship with the European Union to bring that about, and let the people decide in a referendum. I don't expect that leaving the EU is going to mean the imposition of great tariffs or trade barriers across the Channel. Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty obliges the European Union to negotiate a free trade relationship with the departing member state. We are by far the EU's largest market. Germany exports more to us than to France, than to China, than to the United States. They will want to keep selling to us just as much as we want to keep selling to them in the car industry as much as any other. Do the opposition even pretend otherwise? Yes. We look forward to hearing. But what they need to consider is what is the worst case scenario. Even in this incredible position that the EU is going to punish us by putting up these sort of trade barriers against us to cut off its nose to spite its face, the worst that can happen is the application of the common external tariff, averaging less than 4% on those goods to which it's implied. The cost of that would be less than a third of the amount we paid into the EU budget just last year. Engaging with public opinion is the lifeblood of democracy. As a Member of Parliament, I represent my constituents. I vote according to my conscience. I voted for equal marriage, not because David Cameron told me to, but because I believe it is right. I was free to vote against hiking tuition fees because, unlike a party representative in a European Parliament, I report to my constituents and not to my whips. And the Prime Minister accepted my amendment and delivered the only ever cut to the EU budget because we had a majority in Parliament. A democracy's lifeblood is that engagement between people and elected representatives. But in Brussels, public opinion is an obstacle to be overcome, not a reason to change direction. Be it French, Dutch or Irish referendums, or on the streets of Athens now, the European Union has scant regard for public opposition. This is not by accident. The European Union is by design fundamentally anti-democratic. Born from the experiences of World War II, well-intentioned men, and they were all men, sought to design a supranational institution impervious to the consequences of public opinion. In fear of what European politicians call populism, they designed a 1950s solution to a 1940s problem. Through successive treaties, they developed a centralised top-down bureaucracy, which drives policy across Europe. Yes, sir?
Isn't it a very good thing in very many states that there is something called a constitution that works in the same way, that is supposed to resist populism, public whims and wishes, to interact with democracy?
I think there is a very good thing called democracy. and that those of us who seek to represent people should respond to what people want, not call it populism and try and do whatever we want regardless of what people think. In Brussels, the system conspires to ensure that it's the industry lobbyists and special interests which hold sway. Whereas at least in this country, we have a system which is to a degree responsive to the media, responsive to public opinion, responsive to civil society, responsive to the think tanks, and where people actually listen to their constituents. Yet we have the EU, which tells us how to generate our electricity, how we control our borders, how councils tender for local contracts, how we run our NHS, whether we can use health supplements, what age children must have car seats even is determined in Brussels, by a system you're unlikely ever to be able to influence. Yes, I'll take one more step.
Mr. Speaker, might I ask, you refer, do you not, to the European Commission rather than to the European Parliament, in essence? That's the institution you regard as being undemocratic, presumably.
I won't enter into conversation, but I will respond to that point, that it is the EU Commission that's a monopoly on initiating any legislation. I consider that is wrong in a democracy. What we should, if I may continue, sir. I believe in an independent Britain we can make our own laws and trade freely with the world, not just with one declining part of it. And the majority of our exports go outside the EU. They should no longer be hidebound by EU rules, and we will be able to run our domestic economy in our own interests rather than the interests of our EU competitors. Britain should be about more than merely managing decline. The EU used to be a third of the world economy. By 2020, it will be less than a fifth. Instead of attending dozens of meetings about Greece, when the whole Greek economy accounts for less than 3 months' growth in China, our leaders should raise their sights. An independent Britain should have broader horizons, not limiting ourselves to trade with Europe, but engaging with the growing economies in the world. The EU is holding us back. Britain will be better as an independent nation, trading with Europe, but governing ourselves.
To Mark Ratness, and to begin the case for the opposition side, I'd now like to welcome Sir Stephen Hall.
Can we speak from there?
If that's okay.
Sure. Well, Mark talked about the origins of the European community, and it is true that for Britain, after hundreds of years of resisting continental encroachment, emerging from World War II with our institutions intact, whereas those of many of our continental partners were either discredited or in some cases disgraced, the idea of joining in a unique partnership with neighbours in Europe was a difficult issue. And successive governments in the 50s, 60s and early 70s looked at the issue and in a way, looked for an alternative to joining the European community. They looked at the European Free Trade Association, largely a Nordic-led group of countries, including Britain, but it wasn't large enough for Britain's purposes, and most of its members anyway wanted to join the European community. They looked at the idea of a North Atlantic free trade area with the United States, and the United States' view was, you've got to be joking. We regard you as Europeans, we support you joining the European community. And they looked at something that became known as GITA, i.e. go it alone, and concluded that in a world dominated by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, with China rising, that going it alone was simply not a policy for a country which wanted to be able to exercise economic and political influence in the world. Now the question is, are those arguments still valid today? The heart of the European Union was indeed a design to prevent damaging quarrels potentially leading to war between neighbouring countries. That's why you have institutions which in some senses are bigger than the nation state, in that the European Commission, yes, has the sole power of initiative of legislation, although it is voted by ministers elected by their national parliaments and by the European Parliament. The idea being that you have a system which prevents the large from dominating the weak and gives the small power that they wouldn't otherwise have. Now, I sat around the negotiating table in Brussels for 5 years, and I have to say that my view was Not that we were about to become a single country called Europe, but we remained, all of us, ferociously nationalistic, and it would be very easy, without some mechanism of the kind that the European Union provides, it would be very easy for those quarrels to get out of hand. As it is, the mechanisms provide for those quarrels to be contained, and for example, when the French refused to allow imports of British beef into France, the European Commission took them to the European Court. The European Court said the French must come into line. When the French refused to come into line, the European Court imposed fines until they did come into line. So it works at that level.
On that point, sir.
Yes.
So I don't want to over-interpret your case. So are you saying that without the European Union there would actually be war, or what would happen to these disputes?
I'm not saying there would be war. What I'm saying is that when you have very fierce national rivalries, they can very easily degenerate into tit-for-tat trade war. Certainly, I don't mean war in the sense that we had between World War II, but damaging, dangerous quarrels between countries, and that the European Union provides a mechanism for containing those. The other big requirement of European Union membership is that you have to be a democracy. You have to live up to certain democratic standards. That's why Europe was a real draw for countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal when they emerged from dictatorship. It is why the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, emerging from 50 years of Soviet tyranny, were able to form the democratic institutions which give them stability, and in so doing give us stability, because the greatest thing for all of us, it seems to be, in Europe, is that peace and stability, which, yes?
On the issues of security, in that case, would you support the creation of a European army?
No, I don't think, well, I think apart from anything else, I don't think it's realistic that there would be a European army. NATO provides our basic defence against aggression. What the European Union can do, and does increasingly effectively, is peacekeeping. If you look at the recent success against Somalia piracy, that's in large measure down to cooperation among European Union countries. The European Union is trying, okay, it's a difficult task, but trying to help stabilization in the Middle East and so on. But beyond that shared democracy are shared values, which I think through European Union policies we are able to take to the rest of the world. This is soft power rather than hard power. Through our aid policies, and we're the largest aid donor in the world, much larger than the United States. Through our trade policies, the European Union forms trading relationships with as many countries of the world as it can do trade deals with. Those trading relationships are of themselves, it seems to me, an agent for peace. And through the aid and trade relationships, we seek to advance the cause of human rights in other countries in the world. So it seems to me that the European Union works for Britain in two ways. One, it prevents between neighbouring countries those quarrels of which I've spoken about. Two, it enhances our stability because we are surrounded by 26, soon 27 other countries that share our democratic values, and I believe it contributes towards peace and stability in the world through its programme of action. On the narrow economics of it, from the British perspective, we are a market. This is a market of 500 million. It remains our largest market, about 50% of our exports. It's by far and away the largest market for British investment in terms of our investment overseas, inward investment into the UK, much larger than any of our neighbours. France, Germany, Italy and Spain together account for 22% of our exports, compared with China and India that account for 4%. Now, of course, that will evolve over time. And I don't regard membership of the European Union as an article of religious faith. Yes?
Do you not think there are significant dangers, such as allowing terrorists to stay in the UK under Section 8 of the Human Rights Act, that we need to distance ourselves from by leaving the EU?
I don't think that, because I think that whatever the difficulties that you highlight, I believe that membership of the European Union, and to be a member of the European Union, you have to honour the European Human Rights Convention. I believe that those safeguards are vital for the interests of all of us. Okay, we all hate it if there's a terrorist who takes advantage of those rules. But equally, each one of us can stand to benefit from those rules enshrined effectively in the Constitution of the European Union. So I agree, it's an issue, but it seems to me that the advantages in terms of the stabilisation of democracy, our own peace and security, remain for Britain staying a firm and positive member of the European Union.
Thank you very much to Stephen
and interesting and fairly difficult following those two. Last year I saw firsthand and up front the extent to which the European institutions harm the nation states that comprise them and don't support their interests. All the EU does is take away national sovereignty. The EU swamps businesses in unnecessary regulation, and it costs taxpayers billions, 129 billion in 2011 per year. And global growth rates show that the European Union is travelling far behind other countries. It's not recovering. Britain's better off out because Europe is not good for Britain. I lived and worked in Brussels as an assistant to a member of the European Parliament. And even as a committed Eurosceptic, I thought all the stories about an unrepentant gravy train was standard politician rhetoric bashing. But the truth is that the stories barely touch the surface of the pools of bureaucracy and waste that you actually find when you work out there. And I was genuinely flummoxed by the farcical lack of transparency and wasteful ineptitude of European institutions, and I became increasingly certain that there was absolutely no chance of reform. Walking about the corridors and committee rooms of the European Parliament, you would have no idea that the euro crisis has ever happened, or that European citizens' position on Europe seems to be changing so quickly. I mean, the champagne still flows every day. You can walk in every level, and there's some sort of event going on, and no one has a clue at all. The Federalists, they continue to promote further integration, and any hint of Euroscepticism is mocked or ignored. The EU is meant to be a force for good. That is why it was set up, and that's why it's created, and that's what justifies its monumental budget. But the fact is the EU is not working, and it's completely incapable, or more accurately, completely unwilling to change this. While national governments are cutting spending, and public sector jobs are either frozen or sort of across the rest of Europe, salaries are cut, Eurocrats still argued in favour of a budget increase. And whilst Cameron may have won, it wasn't, he hard fought a battle there, and I'm not Tory. And in January this year, Eurocrats saw a 5.5% pay increase. The examples of financial waste, of finance that belongs to British taxpayers as well, are absolutely staggering. The institution's propaganda budget alone is currently 80 million euros per year. The translation department costs over 100 million per year. The Parliament spent 30 million euros just...
Surely all this cost is being refunded to the British public in terms of its free trade agreements with the entirety of the European Union.
I'll take points, but were we outside the European Union, well, for a start, we're a net contributor. We give a lot more than we take back. And regardless, as Mark pointed out, who's to say we couldn't renegotiate Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty? But these are just examples of waste and things that don't need to be done. Do you need to spend 100 million euros a year on translation? And they spent 30 million just on rearranging MEPs' offices. It's just ridiculous. We have 34 information officers.
Can I have a point of information?
Yes, you can.
Wonderful, sir. This is what's called googly in the business. Did you recall the speech by the German president this weekend, in which he said quite categorically that he feels that English should be the only language in the European Union? That is one way of saving the costs that you suggest. That's so perilous.
Well, quite it is, but I don't imagine it's going to happen. And anyway, the monthly jaunt to Strasbourg, where the entire European Parliament of hundreds of thousands of people gets up and moves to Strasbourg, gets 200 million euros a year that's wasted. It doesn't need to be wasted. Look, the fragrant abuse of taxpayers' money won't stop, it will only increase. And the small kleptocratic elite at the heart of the European Union, yes.
Wouldn't you say that all these things you outlined, well, true, isn't that what happens in any kind of parliament, any kind of government, any kind of situation where we have politicians who they live, they have expenses, we need to transport, we need translation, we need documentation and so on. Why would that be different or more harmful in the EU?
I'm saying that the EU needs to understand that when national governments have to cut their budgets, they shouldn't have such flagrant abuses of taxpayers' money. Yes, okay, you need to have translation, but do they need to spend so much? I wrote an article recently where there's €174,000 mistake and nothing was done about it. It was just laughed off and ignored. It's the fact they have no concept of that the money is not theirs to use, it's taxpayers' money. Anyway. No, sorry, I've had enough. But the EU the kleptocratic elites are oblivious to public feeling, and the institutions are intensely against reform. The only way for Britain to regain its sovereignty and repair its economy is to leave the European Union. But way more important than billions and billions of euros that fund this engine of bureaucracy is the catastrophic effect that EU policies are having on the Europeans themselves. I mean, it's true that the recession was global, it wasn't just Europe-based, but Europe is finding recovery distinctly more difficult than the rest of the world. So when the credit crunch began in 2008, yes, unemployment rates in the EU already dwarfed Japan and America. But while the rest of the world started to recover, where the unemployment rate in the United States fell to 7.8%, can you just give me a few minutes? And 40.2% in Japan, the EU keeps downplaying its growth forecasts. We keep hearing from the European Commission and from European representatives that we're out of the woods. And Eurostat, the EU's own statistician, produced figures showing otherwise. Unemployment has soared to 10.7% across 27 EU states, and to a staggering 11.8%. I mean, they're obviously not fixing the problems of what's going on. Okay, go on. And if you look at youth unemployment figures, they're 24.4%, and over half of under 25s out of work in 4 Eurozone countries.
Right, madam.
Yes.
Madam, don't you think that membership of the EU has helped Britain to reform its policy about allowing homosexuals into the military?
Is that true? If it is, then that's fantastic, and that's one fantastic thing the EU's done. But that's one of few. Sorry. So, as I say, youth unemployment's awful, and its entire generation destroyed and the hopes blighted in order to pursue the dream of elites. No! Yes, look, all they do is cry for more Europe. And even Neelie Cross, the Vice President of the European Commission, has admitted growth is low, uncertainty is everywhere, and our people, especially young people, face horrific unemployment. And she's right, she's entirely right. We need innovation and entrepreneurs, but we also need freedom and get rid of Brussels regulation. The problem is that the EU mitigates against both entrepreneurship and innovation because of its restrictive employment legislation. If Britain was to use a fraction of the money that we send to the EU, we could not only stimulate our own economy, but we could support young people, and that's what we need to do as a country. Britain, if we want to recover financially, we want to take, Scotland gets independence, they've been kicked out anyway. If we want to recover, we should take back our sovereignty, and what we need is not more Europe, but yes, less Europe.
I'd like to welcome to THBT.
Hi. I'm from Europe. It gives me such pleasure to be here tonight. Actually, I've been here in London for 20 years. And I'm not alone. In central London, there are 50,000 Germans and as many Italians. There are more than 100,000 Irish and as many Poles. There's 70,000 French. We all love living in this great international city. This is my personal background against which I've come to talk to you here tonight. But what about you? Let's do a little experiment. Who of you has been to Europe? Hands up. Now, not if I listen to some people on the panel. Now, those of you who have been here, before your inner eyes, remember what was it like the last time you were there. And those, I think, 2 of you who hadn't been there, imagine what it would be like. Were you on a Greek island looking at little whitewashed houses? Were you sitting in a little painfully hip Stockholm cafe eating herring? Were you techno dancing in Berlin? Or were you gazing at the spires of the Prague castle? It's a diverse place, this Europe, isn't it? And it's rather nice. It is the job of the European Union to make sure that people, goods and money can flow around this magnificent area of 27 countries freely.
You seem to be giving the impression that, everyone inside proposition seems to be redrawing the lines of the continent. I think they're against the European Union. I don't think they're against Europe as a continent in itself.
Very good point, and I will come to that. It is the job of the European Union to make sure not to make these countries uniform, but to make them open for travel and trade.
You seem to be implying in a certain sense that before the European Union, people couldn't travel and see the sights of Europe, or they couldn't go and live wherever they wanted to, just because of Schengen, which we're not a part of. It doesn't mean that you couldn't travel and work.
If it wasn't for the European Union, I would not be standing here because I would need a work permit, there would be a quota. There is no quota for German think tankers, believe you me. So let me ask you this, why do so many people in this country now fear the European Union as this bureaucratic, burdensome monster that needs to be slain? Let's listen to what they say. They say Europe is strangling the British economy with its regulation. The Eurosceptics claim that EU regulation is costing this country £28 billion a year. Or was it 82? You see, I'm just an economist. I have no idea how you arrive at such figures. What I do know is this. Most of what the European Union does is technical. It's related to the single market. The single market means that British business can sell freely to a market of 500 million wealthy consumers. And it's not tariffs that are holding countries back nowadays from trading from each other. It's non-tariff barriers, it's regulation. Now for some things, such as dangerous chemicals, toys, we have common minimum standards that all European business need to comply with. That's what it allows them to trade freely. In most other areas, we apply something called mutual recognition. That means if the Danish government thinks that what a Danish company makes is good enough for Denmark, we in Britain think it's good enough for us as well. And so Britain doesn't only sell easily to this huge market, we also buy from them. Now let me ask you, how many of you at this very moment are wearing a jumper from a Spanish clothing company starting with Z? How many of you tonight are going to sleep in a bed from a Swedish furniture maker starting with I? How many of you would like to drive a German car? How many of you would like to have a French lover? Okay, back to regulation.
Trading block just to have
We'll come to the emerging markets in just a second. This is such a good point. But back to finish my point on regulation, I have explained that some harmonization of regulation is needed for us to trade freely in Europe. Now the Eurosceptics make their calculations on the basis that if it wasn't for EU regulation, there would be no regulation in this country. I mean, really? We wouldn't allow British companies to make toys and motorbikes with any health and safety standards? Of course we wouldn't. So the question is only this. Would, if there was British regulation rather than European regulation, would it be more burdensome or less burdensome than European regulation? I don't have the answer to this. What I do know is if there was British regulation, you would not have free access to that market of 500 million consumers. But is that market even worth it? Coming to your question about emerging market. Should Britain not be trading with fast-growing countries such as China, India, Brazil? Well, of course it should. Why doesn't it? Oh, because of the European Union. Well, look, Germany is 1.5 times bigger than the UK. It does not sell 1.5 times as many goods to China. It doesn't sell 3 or 4 times as many goods to China. It sells 6 times as many goods to China as Britain. So if the EU is the problem, how can possibly an EU member like Germany sell so many things in China? Surely it has something to do with the structure of the economy. Now to conclude, let me return to Europe. Let us be clear about one thing. On so many things that annoy the Brits about Europe, you are not alone. Angela Merkel wanted a smaller EU budget just as much as David Cameron. Britain is not the only country having an opt-out from the famous Working Time Directive. 15 other EU countries do too. The French and Danes worry just as much about poorer Europeans getting too easy access to their welfare systems. Britain has allies. It can work with them to make the EU function better. It does not have to leave. Britain, the Britain that I know, has the self-confidence and the conviction to do this. It is not a defeatist small island. Most people in Europe want Britain to stay. The Germans wanted to stay because they need an ally who is liberal and outward-looking, and the French want Britain to stay because, like Britain, which thinks global, the Poles and the Romanians want Britain to stay because they agree on the importance of close ties with the United States. And by the way, all of us think that London is a really cool place. So let's stay inside.
And finally, to summarise the case for the proposition side, Lawrence Webb.
Thank you and good evening. This House believes that Britain should leave the European Union. For me, it's a no-brainer. Absolutely we should. The pro side have often said that the benefits of membership of the European Union are self-evident, but I haven't seen them. They don't actually tell you what they are, they just say they're self-evident. It's a bit like a second-hand car salesman telling you that you don't need to look at the warranty or the small print. You know, it's there for all to see. They often say that Eurosceptics like us, they're little Englanders and we want to live in an England of the 1950s. That's not true. For most of my life, Britain has been in the European Union, although it wasn't the European Union when it joined. But also for most of my life, I've been blissfully unaware of the European Union. It didn't matter to me. I got on with my life. I went to school, studied, went travelling. And it's actually whilst I was travelling that I first became aware of the European Union. I was backpacking in New Zealand, and I'd been away for about 2 years by this time. I had a very long period of extended travel, and I had pounds in my pocket, and I was getting 3 Kiwi dollars to the pound, and then overnight, bang, I got 2 Kiwi dollars to the pound, and that was the disastrous exchange rate mechanism which we pulled out with a massive devaluing of the pound. And I thought, what is this? What has happened? I missed many aspects of history because I had a camper van. I was driving around the outback in Australia. I missed vast swathes of things, but suddenly I felt it in my pocket for the first time ever. And then from there I went on to Japan. And it was whilst there, this is the early 90s, that I formed my view of the European Union. Like many people, I taught English, and that's indeed where I eventually ended up running a nightclub. But whilst I was there, it's a story for the bar perhaps. But whilst I was there are several English language Japanese newspapers. And it was whilst reading one of these, and they're not aimed at expats, they're aimed at Japanese businessmen that are going to go and work in Europe. And I would read the Japan Times, and it would say this directive, that directive. It would be explaining what is going to happen to this thing called the single market and how it would affect them. Bear in mind the early 90s, I mean, you probably can't remember this, but it's pre-internet days. So I wasn't able to very quickly look things up. I'd ring home, write to friends and say, do you know what's happening with this? Have you heard about this? And they'd say, no, we know absolutely nothing about it. And it was that made me look at it more deeply. But how times have changed. Those of us in UKIP have argued that legislation from the EU affects every single aspect of our lives. Roughly 80% of our laws originate in Brussels now. But for many years, that was dismissed as nonsense. Yet recently, David Cameron has told us that he's going to renegotiate and get these powers back. So clearly, despite telling us that the EU doesn't affect our lives, it clearly does.
A point of information. Would you not agree that the European Union doesn't control primary, secondary or higher education, doesn't control our armed forces, doesn't control our judiciary, doesn't control our police service, doesn't control our national health service?
It is affecting, our membership does affect all those things. It doesn't control the judiciary, it does on matters like the European arrest warrant. It's very clear they're not allowed to look at the prima facie evidence facing someone. It is a tick box exercise. Let me finish this point. It's a tick box exercise. So long as the forms are filled in correctly, people will be extradited. There's been 1 or 2 cases. A gentleman by the name of Andrew Simiu ended up spending time in Korydallos, which even Amnesty International rated as one of the 3rd worst prisons in the world. And eventually, the charges and the case was dismissed against him. He was set free. Your point, sir.
Isn't it the case that the European arrest warrant has many things with which the European Union gets labelled? Is actually an entirely independent body. It's a private agreement between a number of European member states, but it isn't a European Union institution itself.
No, but it is driven by the harmonisation that is Europe. But anyway, we talked about the single market, and it's the single market that actually drives a lot of this legislation. Now, I myself am a member of a single market. It's called Costco. For anyone who knows it, it's a cash and carry. All right? I pay a membership fee, and I'm able to go there and buy all the goods I need. They sell medicine, motor accessories, through to meat, not horse meat, I hope. But I can go there and I can buy what I want, but what they do not do to me is dictate how I live my life. They don't tell me how I dispose of my rubbish. Landfill directive.
Sorry. In that case, you won't be telling the Romanians what to do with their lives when they choose to come here.
Well, I would argue that if we were outside the European Union, they wouldn't be coming here, but I'll come on to that point. So, also, they don't restrict the other markets that I can visit. I can go to Tesco or Sainsbury's if I choose. And in fact, last year, I successfully renegotiated my membership of this particular single market. And in doing so, I now get a rebate. There's my voucher, £17.13. And the point there is that you cannot achieve those things in the European Union. There is no clear benefit, in my mind, of us belonging. The legislation we receive far outweighs the benefits. One of the points, the free movement of people. I'm a qualified electrician. I've worked on many sites across London. And a few years ago, the painters and decorators were up in arms. And I said, what's wrong, guys? And they said, the boss has told us our day rate is coming down from 90 to £80 a day. I said, well, that's terrible. What are you going to do about it? They said, nothing. I said, why not? Because the governor's told us he can get a poll for 50. Membership of the European Union and the mass migration of people has forced down the wages of the semi-unskilled people in this country. Yet they are competing for housing by the new migrants coming to this country. So there are many aspects which I think clearly demonstrate that we should leave the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you to Lawrence Webb. And finally, to close the case for the opposition side, I'd like to welcome Peter Wilding.
Oh dear. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I mean, these fine people to my left remind me of that wonderful phrase, the chilling phrase of Dean Acheson, the former American Secretary of State. They've lost an empire, but they haven't yet found a role. And the problem is, I mean, the combined arguments of my three compatriots here, who I sort of basically suggest are the love children of Lord Salisbury and Margaret Thatcher together, suggests that actually there is absolutely no point whatsoever in understanding the modern world. And the modern world is not the world of 1939, it's not the world of 1945, it's the world of today. And today's world is based on one question: who makes the rules? And the rules are made in a number of places throughout the world. Our foreign policy, the United Nations. Our defense policy, NATO. Our financial policy, IMF. Our trade and commercial policy, Europe. And the reason Europe is of value to us is because Europe is the biggest trading bloc in the world, in a world which is coalescing around trading blocs today. And I would suggest to Mark, if I may, no love child going on here. But this is something that he didn't say. I am sure in his constituency he's got haulage companies. I'm sure in his constituency haulage companies go from Rochester to Italy. Before the single market, that haulage company would have to have filled out 88 separate pieces of paper to get the goods made in Rochester to Rome. Now it's just one.
On that point, sir.
Yes, my dear From what I remember from Mark's speech, he advocated remaining a trading partner from Europe. It was just the legislative bits he didn't like. So how could we not keep that, not distinguish?
Well, I just ask him this question: who would he want to be making the rules that govern his haulage company? The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom or President Hollande? It's quite obvious. The fact of the matter is this story is all about power. It's not about little bits of Costco paper. It's not about this little bit of naughty legislation. It's about the exercise of power in the modern world. And the problem with this country, ladies and gentlemen, is that we do not have any longer delusions of grandeur. We have delusions of weakness. We have absolutely no concept of the power and influence that we exercise, not only in Europe, but through Europe in the world. So why is it, for example, that in January the Americans said to us, in no uncertain terms, we want a strong Britain in a strong Europe? Why did they say that? Is there something that we're missing? Why do the Swedes say exactly the same thing? The Swedish Foreign Minister, Anders Borg. Why do the Germans say the same thing? Why do the Australians say the same thing? Why do the Japanese, who never say anything, say the same thing? It's because I think there's something about what they're saying which is important. For the Americans, for example, they have just announced in Obama's speech that he wants an EU-US free trade deal. Why is that important? Is it a matter of square bananas or fruit and harmonizing bits of legislation? No, ladies and gentlemen, it's about the modern world. It's about creating a free market of the biggest trading nations of the world, Europe and America. And the purpose of that is to make the legislation that enables goods and services to travel around the world. With 60 million people, we wouldn't stand a chance. It's an illusion to think in the modern world that our exercise of power and influence in Europe, 500 million people, could be bettered by us negotiating like Switzerland.
Points of information. If there is to be a giant free trade area encompassing the whole of the EU and the whole of North America, why then do we still need to be governed by the EU?
Yes.
Well, this is the delusion at the heart of Marx's argument. He thinks that all that's going to happen is that we can negotiate a nice little free trade zone. But free trade zones require rules. Rules have to be made. You can't sell your widget in Italy or Rome or Romania or Germany without having agreed rules. Surely we, Britain, as the purveyor of three concepts which have succeeded in governing not only Europe but the world since the war, the rule of law, democracy and freedom, would believe that the means of making rules to sell your stuff should be made somewhere.
Surely whether you should be able to sell your widget should depend on when the customer wants to buy it.
Yeah.
Precisely. Right. But the fact is, wouldn't your businesses want to be assured that the widget that they make in Rochester could be sold in Rome, and you, your government, would have the power to influence the law that is made? How would you do that, Mark? How would you do that if you were outside the European Union, if you were outside the structures that makes the rules, which keeps jobs in your constituency? I think you are playing fast and loose with the prosperity of your own constituents. My final point. If you don't agree with me that Britain has power in the world, if you agree with these people that actually there are the modern equivalent of tanks at Dover, and all Europe is something that does bad things to us, I'll give you two things. Britain created the modern European Union. It did it through Margaret Thatcher's creation and delivery of the single market, and John Major's creation and delivery of the enlarged single market through the post-communist states. That is a brilliant achievement. It's an achievement that people to my left signally forget, although these are a superb achievement of what Britain is about, which is pushing freedom and democracy and the rule of law as far as it can go. It's 2-0 to us. And if only the people to my left finally realize that we've got to be in it to win it, that means we will have a successful Britain in a successful European Union. And my final point, we don't give this place our full attention. We don't give it the time it deserves. We are wasting our time when we should be thoroughly engaged in winning the battle of what is a new creative space in Europe. It's changing. As Katinka said, we have allies. We're not alone. We've got Germany. Superb ally to have. And I want to finish off. Laugh? The biggest country in Europe? I'd rather have them as an ally. 60 years ago, democracy ended at Dover. Now it ends at the Dnieper. Freedom was nowhere to be seen, and the only democracies were two, Britain and America. I consider it a considerable achievement of us to create a Europe in which freedom reigns. I don't want to leave it.